Hi, and welcome to another Together Talks. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Jacob Mchangama, who has written a phenomenal book. But before I talk about the book with him, just to tell you a little bit about Jacob, he's a Danish human rights advocate and lawyer. He's also a social commentator. He's currently director of Justicia, which is a think tank which concentrates on free speech and the rule of law and human rights. He's had a podcast for quite some time that many of you may well be familiar with, called Clear and Present Danger, a history of free speech. And many of the ideas that are in the book have been discussed and handled in the podcast as well. And it's got a lot of international popularity. I suppose from my first question to you, just to get into this, is do you think that we'll ever have a situation where there will be unbridled free speech? Or do you think that, like the examples you gave with the American Constitution, for instance, where 1 minute people pen something saying there'll be free speech, then a few years later there's a Sedition Act. Do you think that when people get in power, then invariably they're always going to try and stop free speech? Or do you think it's possible that we could say something that we could achieve?
You know, I think we've made great strides, even if I think, we're currently going through a free speech recession. Clearly, we've made great strides, especially in democracies. But I don't think we'll ever get to a situation where globally, universally, there'll be sort of unbridled free speech, just because I think in many ways it's a counterintuitive principle. It's very difficult for the human psyche and sort of to handle the principle of free speech. And we're extremely good at coming up with these justifications for limiting free speech, which we can convince ourselves are proper and necessary, but that really reflect our underlying biases and ideological preferences. And sometimes we may even, just tell ourselves that they're not really restrictions of free speech at all. So I think that's what we're up against. We're up against sort of very strong parts of our own human nature that are hardwired into our brain, and that it's likely to be a formidable obstacle towards complete free speech.
But it does throw up the thing that you quote really brilliantly in here, several points, talking particularly in the modern period, but just the idea that people are not to be trusted. Ordinary people, maybe what they might once have called the great unwashed, this kind of mob, they're not like the great and the good, not like the smart ones, not like the people that make the rules. And of course, we can all understand free speech and we can be tolerant and moderate, but those people out there, they can't cope with it. How would you address that?
You have a constant clash or recurring clash between a more egalitarian conception of free speech versus a more elitist conception of free speech. And we can trace the egalitarian conception all the way back to the Athenian democracy, which for its time was radically egalitarian, and the elitist to the Roman conception of free speech, which is much more elitist, top-down approach. And what we see is that every time there's a democratization of the public sphere, if you like, through technological developments, it could be the printing press, it could be radio, telegraph, or through political developments, should the poor and poverty-less, women, religious minority, racial minorities have a voice in public affairs, there's this almost existential dread on the part of the privileged, who serve as sort of the gatekeepers of and filter information down to those who are seen as too credulous and dangerous and unworthy of being able to understand and have a voice in public affairs. And for a while there, with the internet, I think democracies actually were very enthusiastic about the egalitarian promise of the internet and early social media. But then, first of all, the internet changed, so it became much less decentralized, much less horizontal, and much more vertical with big centralized platforms, but also events like the election of Trump and things sort of changed institutional attitudes. And suddenly today we see an enormous pressure, an enormous drive by democracies to try and reimpose sort of top-down control on the internet and social media companies which, they're often, these attempts are really often camouflaged as a sort of saying, oh, we don't want these big tech companies to be responsible for democratic debate. We want democratic accountability. But when you really investigate it closer, it's clear that what they're worried about is the end users. It's the users themselves. So they're afraid that, as you said, the unwashed mob will have unmediated access to information that is, disinformation, hate speech, and extreme speech. And sometimes these concerns are not without merits. The more people you get online with a direct voice, the more diverse stuff you're going to find out there. So you can certainly find things that are deeply unpleasant, and sometimes things that might even cause real harms. But I think we also tend to forget the very significant benefits we derive from egalitarian free speech and access to information that we just take for granted in democracies, even though the opportunities that we have to speak and access information is unprecedented compared to previous generations, and depend on a principle of free speech.
Your book, Free Speech, A Global History from Socrates to Social Media. I mean, we know that Socrates was put on trial for asking very simple questions.
The example of Socrates is interesting in the sense that Socrates is not really sort of a clear proponent of the Athenian democracy in which he lives, and which has provided him. Let's not forget he's 70 years old before he's being put on trial. So for decades he's sort of been roasting his Athenian co-citizens in the Agora and asking them uncomfortable questions, and sort of subjected them to intellectual stripteases. So in many ways, he exercised what the Athenians called parousia, which means something like uninhibited speech. But Socrates had very close relations with oligarchs who had overthrown the Athenian democracy, and he had also said things about whether it was really wise to allow the unwashed mob to participate in democratic decision making. So I think there's a case to be made that he was subjected to a trial on the part of more militant Democrats, and so in that sense there's perhaps a parallel to today where democracies limit free speech out of a wish to protect democracy against its enemies, and so in that sense there might be a parallel to Socrates. Of course, Socrates was also indicted for impiety, sort of introducing new gods and going against the prevalent religious ideas. But I think there's a lot to it to argue that it was very much also a political case against him by partisans of democracy who feared a rerun of the 30 tyrants that had basically killed and purged Democrats before Democrats managed to take over the state again.
It does seem today, just on a sort of more cultural reference, that any discussion about the classics or the past is seen as really elitist, and it's almost like these dead white men that just wanted to impose all this cruelty on everyone. Just a little bit on that point, on the cultural point and the importance of history to understand where we've got to. What would you say on that in the context of free speech and generally?
Especially when you live in democracies, you cannot ignore the fact that democracy developed in Athens, even though they had a direct democracy and we live in representative democracies. And I think, of course, there might have been other civilizations that had democracy and free speech and that the sources just don't survive. But from what I have been able to piece together, Athens is also the first polity that really institutionalizes free speech in its politics and culture. And so I think there's a lot to learn there, and also universal lessons. The history of free speech is not uniquely Western, and its roots are sort of ancient, deep, and sprawling. So I think it's important to try and piece all of that together and see the common threads and also the differences between different ages and parts in the world. And I think that there are certain themes that go again, that reverberate across cultures and time periods.
I want to ask you, just because then we get into the kind of perhaps the story that many people know, but this explosion that happens with both the Reformation and Martin Luther and the Gutenberg press, and the fact that pamphleteering and everything expands and explodes. Just, do you want to talk a bit about kind of how you think that sort of has played out and led to where we are?
Yeah, sure. So the Reformation and the printing press becomes a really explosive cocktail. And I think it's important to note that at this point of time, you don't really have any developed theories of free speech or free speech principles. That there are not many people, if any, at this time, who believe that universal religious freedom or universal free speech, also on political matters, are important principles. So in many ways, the huge impact of the Reformation and the printing press on free speech is the unintended consequences of that development. You know, initially the Catholic Church is quite enthusiastic about the printing press because it allows it to spread Orthodox Catholicism and sort of entrench its authority and its teachings, make them more uniform across Christendom. But then comes along this ornery, constipated German monk called Martin Luther, who sort of increasingly looks upon the Catholic Church as corrupting true Christianity. And he starts churning out pamphlets after pamphlet attacking the church. And he does it, he revolutionizes really the way of communicating. So instead of writing these dry theological treatises in Latin, he writes in the vernacular German. He writes sort of short, punchy pamphlets with cartoons and memes. And he really appeals to the ordinary commoner. So he engages in what you might call religious populism. And I think, you know, if Martin Luther had been on Twitter, he would have been prolific and have had a huge following. And there would likely have been a lot who tried to cancel him because he also said some pretty outrageous stuff. So that really becomes part and parcel of the Reformation. He also champions the idea that ordinary people should be taught to read and write because that will give them access to the Bible and the eternal truths of God. You shouldn't make the leap from the fact that Luther challenges the Catholic Church teachings that he provides ordinary people the access to read and write the Bible with the idea that he's in favor of universal religious tolerance of free speech. Martin Luther, I think, believes that he has found the truth, like the true Catholicism, if you like, whereas the Catholic Church is a scam. And so he thinks that people should be taught to read and write so that they themselves can discover this truth that he has found. But he does not believe, and this becomes very clear, that all the other people who then study the Bible and come up with alternatives to his brand of Christianity should be given the right to do so. He thinks that it's a horrendous idea that has very bad consequences. He's not in favor of peasants reading the Bible and finding passages that support their right to rebel against oppressive princes, so he advocates that they be slaughtered like dogs. He's not in favor of Anabaptists who are against infant baptism and believe in sort of proto-communism. He's not in favor of his rivals in Calvin and Zwingli and others, and he comes to believe that blasphemy really should be punished with death. And he's also engages towards the end of his life in rabid anti-Semitism propaganda that is later used by the Nazis, actually. But, you know, the unintended consequences of what he did, what he unleashed, is extremely important for the later development towards a more principled free speech, because people get slowly accustomed to new ideas. Theories of tolerance are adopted, and the printing press just becomes an institution. And even though there are furious attempts to try and censor it and limit it, that goes on for centuries, Luther and the Reformation is a real key moment, I think. But then, you know, if you jump to the 17th century, you start to have real theories of free speech. But even some of the champions of that period are not sort of principled. So John Milton is a good example. He publishes Areopagitica in 1644, unlicensed, and it's, on the face of it, it's a really powerfully, eloquently written attack on pre-publication censorship. But then when you read it more closely, you see that he's not in favor of press freedom for Catholics. He's in favor of burning impious and seditious books. He later comes out in favor of a very draconian blasphemy ban. And the ultimate irony is that John Milton ends up working as a censor under Cromwell, and his sort of military dictatorship, I guess you could call it, of a kind. So that's why I call it Milton's curse, this unprincipled selective defense of free speech, which has afflicted many great free speech champions, and which I think is part of human nature, unfortunately, why we so often see people defending free speech for me, but not for thee.
We are beneficiaries of many of the battles that have been fought, and much of the bravery of many people that put their lives on the line for free speech. How do you think that's regarded today? I mean, that might sound a bit dramatic, but how do you think people really think about that?
The same person might write something deeply critical about the government or some institution that they don't like, and then in the next tweet or Facebook update, they might demand that certain groups or views should be banned. And I don't think people sort of think about that they are exercising a right that has been very dearly won, and that many of the ideas that are orthodoxy today in open democracies were seditious, blasphemous, treasonous not that many centuries ago, and would have sent you to prison or worse. And the first half of the 19th century in the UK saw pretty draconian punishments of people who advocated in favor of universal suffrage, for instance. So if you were to criticize the fact that the working classes were not represented in parliament, did not have a right to vote, that could see you being punished for sedition. If you were to criticize Christian theology, Christian ideas, that could see you punished for blasphemous libel. And someone like Richard Carlile spent something like 6 years in prison in total for blasphemous ideas, for selling Tom Paine, who had a unique gift of mixing both seditious and blasphemous libel in his works, because you were not allowed to sell Tom Paine to the lower classes. You could sell Tom Paine at a higher price to the higher classes, but certainly not to the lower classes. And it's made quite clear in the prosecutions that it's dangerous to introduce the lower and illiterate classes to these ideas that would undermine sort of the class-based hierarchical nature of British society at the time. And today, we have a more egalitarian order. And if a British politician today was to come out and say, I don't believe that the poor and propertyless should have a right to vote in the UK, that would cause an uproar. But that was sort of 200 years ago. That was sort of a mainstream opinion, and something that would be backed up by harsh punishments. But we don't take it for granted that we have a right to challenge those oppressive ideas today, nor do we see the connection between us wanting to prohibit ideas that challenge our orthodox views today with how people back then tried to defend their ideas. But we have to remember that people at the time were not evil. I think they tried. They saw it genuinely. Someone like Burke, for instance, who was often celebrated by conservatives, he was very much against the ideas of Tom Paine and the French Revolution. And he believed very strongly that you needed a hierarchical society, one that protected specific religious ideas, one that limited political participation to certain classes, and that would be the best society. And he looked to France and the French Revolution, and he saw, not unreasonably, chaos and anarchy. And I think some of the ideas that we hold today future generations are likely to look back on them and say, how could they believe such things? And so that's why one of the reasons why it's important to be principled about free speech, even if you can't imagine that the ideas that you hold dear today could in any way be wrong, or should be criticized by others.
I would love to hear what you think about what has led to the idea that things should be cancelled and not spoken about rather than discussed and debated. Is it a sort of sense of fear of the people again coming out, or is it just that people should not be offended and it's dangerous?
That's a very good question, and one that I probably cannot give an authoritative answer to, but I can sort of try to speculate. And I think there are probably various reasons. One of them being that the generations coming after the boomer generation have, and I'm talking about the West here, have not really experienced authoritarianism. They've not, and they've not experienced the huge shift in what can be said and what could not be said culturally. That also happened in the 60s and 70s, and which was associated with the idea of free speech. So at the time, for the boomer generation, I think free speech was seen as a very progressive value, something that was closely aligned with the empowerment of human agency and the ability to challenge norms and values that were seen as outdated and oppressive. Whereas subsequent generations have taken it for granted. And also, I think they are, and which is a good thing, I think they are typically, younger generations tend to be much more concerned about equality and tolerance towards minorities, for instance, and various traditionally marginalized groups. And they tend to view free speech as a threat to minorities, to tolerance and equality, rather than the precondition and safeguard for equality and tolerance. And so when free speech and tolerance and equality are seen to clash, they will favor equality and tolerance over free speech. They basically understand free speech and equality, at the extreme at least, as values that are mutually exclusive. Whereas I would argue that free speech and equality and tolerance are values that are mutually reinforcing. So they haven't experienced the way in which in the US, for instance, free speech was absolutely essential for the civil rights movement to champion its cause of increased racial justice. They haven't seen how anti-colonial movements relied on free speech to further the cause of independence from European colonial powers. They haven't seen how free speech at the international level was instrumental in defeating apartheid and so on. And so if you're brought up with the internet, then where free speech is taken for granted, then you might focus more on how extremists are suddenly amplified and give voice to ideas that seem antithetical to your worldviews. So I think that's part of the explanation. And then we have that age-old human tendency to think that ideas that clash with our deepest held values should not be protected and should be or should even be actively suppressed.
You talk about Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. I mean, Gandhi, I think, used the expression that with free speech and free expression are the two lungs that are required for freedom. But when you say it's that they've come around in the internet generation and it's post-boomer, and surely it's the sense that where we get our learning, partly culturally, right, in society, but part the academy. Surely universities and schools and a sense of pride in a democratic nation state, the institutions, the gatekeepers, holding up the idea of free speech, explaining the necessity and the relationship between that and all things. Is it not that that's been evacuated a little bit, that there's a kind of relativist notion that's become much more pervasive at the very core of institutions? I noticed that you worked with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education in America, FIRE it's called, that's done a lot of work, particularly in the universities there. Isn't that part of what's led to it, not just a general thing that they haven't really been around the scene, the 60s and the 70s, but a very specific thing about the kind of institutions of education and culture that we have that have kind of turned their back on it somewhat, on free speech?
Yeah, I think that contributes, and especially probably sort of in the Anglosphere, you see this tendency more forcefully than in other places. It's not really that prevalent here in Denmark, for instance. But I think that also has to do with the fact that the values of tolerance and equality are very, very dominant among staff, faculty, and students at universities. And if that is built then on a logic where free speech is a threat to these values, then it's perhaps not surprising that the commitment towards viewpoint diversity and free speech is much less robust now on many elite universities than they were previously, because it's built on this logic. Even though I suppose that if you looked at, for instance, American elite universities, they would probably, both the staff and the students there would be generally much more acceptant towards minorities, sexual, racial, ethical, and so on, than the ordinary population. So even though these are the bastions of progressive liberal ideals of equality and tolerance and acceptance, parts of them cannot accept the idea that these values should be challenged by the exercise of free speech that is seen as running counter to those ideas. So that's a good example of how orthodoxies of any kind come to impose certain regimes of intolerance, if you like, towards ideas that are seen as dangerous, and that orthodoxy and the red lines will shift depending on the predominant values of those who shape the institution or the government.
What would be your message to anyone who said that equality and tolerance is more important than free speech? I mean, can you really have one without the other? And how can you convince anyone of the importance of tolerance and equality if you don't have free speech?
Free speech might be the most powerful engine of human equality that our species has ever stumbled upon, because it has been absolutely instrumental for religious minorities, for racial minorities, for women, for everyone who's staked a claim for acceptance and equality and tolerance. And the real meaning of tolerance is, of course, to suffer something which you don't approve of. And so tolerance and free speech are in many ways two sides of the same coin. Real tolerance depends, or real free speech depends on tolerance, and I would say vice versa. It doesn't really matter which cause you want to advance, whether it's racial justice, whether it's climate change, whether it's the rights of migrants, whether you're concerned about restrictive abortion laws. Your ability to change people's minds, to advocate effectively, depends on free speech, unless you're willing to use violence, of course. You want to be able to persuade and petition politicians. You want to be able to organize protests. You want to be able to write op-eds, to have placards and so on. And often you want to use hyperbolic language in order to advance your case and get attention. And so if you don't see that restrictions on free speech undermines that ability, that you're basically pulling up the ladder after yourself, if once you've sort of achieved your the degree of social or political power, and then you don't want free speech for others, and that might be dangerous, especially for minorities, because if new groups come into power, then they may use those restrictions on free speech for their own causes, and that is especially dangerous to minorities, who then depend on the goodwill of any given political majority rather than on a commitment to principle. And I think, you know, we've seen time and time and again how this has played out in history. So you could take Christianity. Christianity starts out as a strange cult which is persecuted on and off in the Roman Empire, and then once it becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire, Christianity becomes extremely intolerant towards not only pagans but also um, heretical Christian sects. So it goes from being the persecuted to the persecutor. You could take socialism in the same way. So for much of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, socialists are persecuted viciously, and including, of course, in Russia. But then when Lenin takes over, he is very explicit about limiting free speech and press freedom. It cannot be extended to the bourgeoisie because it's as dangerous as machine guns and bombs. So we see that time and again, and perhaps the most pernicious example is that of, you know, the fall of the Weimar Republic in Germany, where Nazis, when they come into power through democratic means, use the very restrictions aimed at protecting democracy in the Weimar Constitution to actually abolish it by suspending free speech and other civil liberties. So in that sense, I think looking at history, it's a dangerous game that people committed to tolerance and equality are playing when they think that they can ensure these values through limiting free speech, when in fact those values have only been won through the exercise of free speech, and future commitment to them will also have to rely on the use of free speech.
There's this kind of real sense, is there not, that people who believe they're about equality and tolerance have actually ended up becoming, perhaps as you've begun to point out there, really, really tyrannical in not allowing open debate and discussion and forcing people to be silenced. Often we've seen people lose their jobs in the academy. We've seen, you know, people being taken down. There's an actual sense that you don't have a conversation about the issue anymore in many areas. You just try and cancel the person saying the thing.
But I think it points to something quite important, namely that the culture of free speech is extremely important. And this is not a new insight. This was something that John Stuart Mill, for instance, emphasized in On Liberty, his classical work on liberty and free speech. He says that protection against society's tendency to impose its views on dissenters is as important as protection against the tyranny of the magistrate. In other words, so he's talking about the sort of conservative Victorian norms of the day that he sees constraining the possibility of people to speak openly. George Orwell will say the same thing after the Second World War. He says something along the lines that, you know, actually wartime censorship in the UK was not as bad as you could have feared. But the real problem in the UK is that newspapers are owned by a few wealthy men, and that there are these taboos by the intelligentsia about what you can and cannot say, and that is in practice sets up limits on what can be said. And of course, you've had also at American universities previously, you've had a situation where if you were against American involvement in World War I, for instance, you'd be fired on the spot if you had socialist tendencies. And now people who would have views that would certainly have seen them been fired 100 years ago are demanding new red lines that should not be challenged, and trying to impose them on academia on issues like race and gender and the like, and that I think is something that should be fought vigorously. That said, it's often more difficult to define clear limits when it comes to sort of the culture of free speech, because the concept of cancel culture has also sometimes been abused by people who say, oh, you know, people criticize me on Twitter, or I'm afraid to speak out because people will criticize me, or, you know, and, you know, of course it's unpleasant to be criticized, but, you know, if people listen to this podcast episode episode and think that I'm, an idiot, and they, all the listeners sort of pile up and attack me on Twitter, that's not an attack on my right to free speech. It's other people exercising their right to call me an idiot. But there's a difference between that and then saying, oh, Jacob should be fired from his work, or Twitter should ban him, or so. I think that's a very useful way of distinguishing between what are genuine threats to cancel culture and what are not. So the idea that in order to challenge ideas you don't like, you argue not with arguments, but you argue, or you try to punish that person with disciplinary or economic sanctions, and that I think is something to be warned against.
So when someone like Kathy Hochul argues that in a terrible situation where people are shot, and it clearly was racist, it was, I mean, it's very abundantly obvious, it seems, that was the case, and it was terrible and nasty and full of terrible ideas. And you make the point that ideas can actually influence people, right? They can influence people.
Yeah, sure.
There's always a debate about how much, but then it's being used to silence and increase prevention of things being discussed on big tech, which is really like the public square, is it not? How do you see that? Just take us through that a little bit, if you would.
So it's a knee-jerk reaction, really, every time you see a horrific event, sort of like this racist terrorist attack in Buffalo, with a lot of people being shot, and then the knee-jerk reaction is to say we need to have tougher laws against hate speech online, and big tech needs to do more to remove such content. And as you said, I agree that ideas can inspire or incite extreme acts. You couldn't have a genocide without first dehumanizing a particular group and sort of inciting people into attacking that group subsequently. And clearly, many of these mass shootings by white supremacists have sort of a general modus operandi, in that they publish these semi-coherent manifestos that often copy from each other, and they have sort of broadly overlapping ideas about the white race being under attack and the great replacement and all these things. So clearly ideas influence them, but the fact that speech might sometimes lead to terrible acts does not necessarily mean that restrictions will be an efficient way of countering him, nor that this uncertain benefits that you might gain from prohibiting certain ideas will outweigh the unintended negative consequences. So, for instance, when people in the US say, oh, look, we don't have hate speech laws in the US, we place too much emphasis on free speech. Well, go and look at other mass shooters. So take Anders Breivik in Norway, who murdered, I think 70 or something like that, young social democrats, and set off bombs in Oslo. He operated in a country that does have a hate speech ban. Take the perpetrator of the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand. He operated in New Zealand, which also has a ban against certain types of hate speech. Or Germany, which probably have the most restrictive laws against hate speech in the West, where you've had, and they specifically adopted a law in 2017 obliging big tech companies to remove illegal speech, including hate speech, online within 24 hours or risk huge fines. And since then, they've seen a wave of attacks. So you had a neo-Nazi who tried to gain entry into a synagogue and kill people there. He didn't succeed, so he went and killed some others at a kebab shop. And you had a neo-Nazi killing a pro-immigrant politician, and you had a neo-Nazi go and kill, I think, 11, many of them immigrants. So and of course you could also look at sort of jihadist terrorist attacks in the West, where if you go to the UK and France, you have pretty stringent laws about what you can say about terrorism. You can't glorify it and so on, and that has not prohibited very bloody attacks being carried out. In fact, we do have some data that suggests and research that suggests that the countries in Western Europe that do the most to crack down on right-wing extremist views also tend to experience the most right-wing extremist violence. So that sort of supports the idea of free speech acting as a safety valve. So if you try to restrict extreme views, it might act like a pressure cooker, and people will feel more legitimized in taking violent action. And I think we also have some research that actually shows that people, psychologically speaking, who feel that they're being the subject of repression will be more likely to feel that violence against the government is justified. So in that sense, it's not clear that restricting free speech is an efficient cure. It might actually be counterproductive. And of course, the other thing is, especially when you look at big tech, is that there'll be collateral damage to legal speech. Already now, I would say that probably the vast majority of the content removed as hate speech by Facebook and Twitter is speech that is lawful within democracies where they remove it. It's just that they frame their hate speech policies in such a manner that it's broader than what is criminalized under the law. And one of the reasons they do that is because they don't want to run afoul of notice and takedown laws like the German SDG, like the Online Safety Bill, which is on its way in the UK, and the Digital Services Act that the European Union has all but agreed upon. But I think that free speech advocates have to do a better job, not only of warning against the dangers of limiting free speech, but do a much better job of showing how free speech can actually be used positively to counter hate, to counter extremism, to expose and debunk misinformation and so on. I think we need to make a more positive case for free speech rather than always only warning about the dangerous consequences of censorship and repression.
Just the last 2 years, generally, it seems that, and this is definitely true for the United Kingdom, there was often subjects that were just off, they were taboo, you weren't allowed to do them. Often any question about vaccine efficacy, as well as a political dimension to it in terms of people were actually smeared purposely. For instance, the Great Barrington Declaration that had many well-known epidemiologists from Harvard and Oxford University and others who had a different view to perhaps what the particular outlook on the policy decisions were of some. I mean, how do you see, firstly, just if you can, what's happened in the last couple of years? Do you think that's had an impact on what's gone on in terms of what can be said and not? Science obviously depends on free speech.
It's quite interesting that the Royal Society, I think in December or January, published a report about scientific misinformation, and the report by preeminent scientists in the UK actually came out very strongly arguing against the idea that scientific misinformation should be purged or banned online, saying this is a counterproductive measure and one that might actually lead to less trust in institutions rather than more trust, just because science depends on various theories competing with each other, and of course when you're confronted with a brand new virus that you haven't confronted before, your theories and the knowledge, the best available knowledge, is likely to change. But if you then enforce the best available scientific agreement, that might be based on sort of 2 weeks of non-peer-reviewed data, just because you're trying to combat a deadly virus at breakneck speed, then the best available knowledge is likely to be outdated or only partially true and correct. And this is, I think, especially crucial during a pandemic like emergencies, where understandably the public is extremely concerned, and where we are much more willing to trade away basic principles and freedoms in order to feel safe and secure. The pandemic has been used as a way to introduce laws against false information that really are aimed at punishing dissent. And we've even seen it on social media, sort of how the lab leak theory was at one point restricted by Facebook, and then new information emerged that made it look less implausible, perhaps.
What would be your message, though, to the UK government about the online safety bill?
The UK should play a positive, be a positive role model for free speech in Europe, even though you're not part of the European Union, and say, we will provide an alternative to, for instance, the Digital Services Act and the top-down approach to social media, and show that in robust democracies with strong institutions, we actually believe that free speech is a competitive advantage. It's an ideal that we want to cherish, and we want to have a minimalist approach to restricting free speech. And if the UK could stand out for the world to see, that would be a very exciting experiment, and something that other countries could then follow. So that would be my recommendation, and then sort of look back in British history and look at the many examples of where governments have decided that it was absolutely necessary to crack down on various forms of information. And typically, I would argue, politicians and others today would not find that those restrictions were justified. And I think we're likely to look back in 20 or 30 years and say that the online safety bill was not fit for an open liberal democracy like the UK.
And what would you say to the likes of Twitter and Facebook and big tech when they're thinking about their policies? What would you say about how would you put forward the argument that we need to have free speech and open debate?
I would urge them to experiment with something like distributed content moderation. So empower users to have more control over content rather than and resist the increasing demands that they adopt more restrictive models of centralized content moderation. So trust users more to be able to determine the rights and wrongs, and limit themselves to the worst of the worst. That's still, content moderation at scale with billions of people is basically an impossible task, but they could limit sort of the gray areas and the collateral damage to free speech if they empowered users more than they do now.
If there's one example or one character from history that you would cite, who would it be in terms of resonating the idea of free speech?
Maybe Frederick Douglass, the great American orator who was born a slave and became a very prominent abolitionist. He said that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. And he also said that free speech is a universal human right. It does not depend on the color of your skin or the size of the wallet. It is based on human nature, and there let it rest forever. And I think he was a very, very eloquent and clear-sighted defender of robust free speech.
Where can people go and find out a bit more about you if they want to?
So they can go to futurefreespeech.com, which is the Future Free Speech project that I direct as part of Justitia. They can go to @JMCHANGAMA, J Mchangama on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle. And I also have a homepage called jacobmchangama.com, where you can find all reviews, articles, interviews, including this one, all of it in one place.
We'll also be featuring the book for members and signatories and others. And I'd love to carry on the conversation, perhaps if you're in the UK at some point. I understand you are going to be in the summer and ongoing, but thank you for today, and brilliant book. And we look forward to more conversations on the importance of free speech. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you so much, Alan. It was a real pleasure.